When I was a boy, I almost drowned. I grew up in a fishing village where everything was about the water, the wind, and the catch. I was about 9, 10 at the time, and it was my first night on the water with the men, my father, my uncle, my older brothers. And for all the world, I wanted them to know that I was ready for this. I was ready to take on my role and responsibility here. It was an hour before dawn. A stiff wind was blowing in from the sea. I was cold, but I did my best not to show it. I really didn't have any responsibilities as a kid. Just one thing they all said: whatever else, stay clear of the nets. It's funny in life. The one thing you know not to do is the one thing you end up doing. The men threw out that net, that thick, heavy thing, and I was standing too close. My ankle got snagged, and I got flung overboard with the net and got entangled along the way. I knew how to swim, but I panicked instead. I opened my mouth and ended up swallowing great gulps of water. I remember thinking, I'm going to drown down here. Just then, my father is by my side, slicing the net in the water and letting me free, bringing me back to the surface, and then over to the boat and getting me back inside. And once inside, he looked down closely at me to see if I was okay. And when he realized I was, he turned. "Some fisherman you'll be," he said. And years later, another man said the very same thing, but meant in something entirely different. Well, I grew up to become a fisherman. I got married, raised a family, and each night when I took those young ones and put them down for the night, I went down to the lakeside, and along with my brother Andrew, we spent the night chasing fish, throwing out those nets until our arms gave out, grateful for whatever we brought in to sell, to feed our family along the way. Now, there's something you ought to know about fishermen. Fishermen have their superstitions. You can get caught in a spell where those fish want nothing to do with you, and all you're doing is spending time, doing time out there on the water until your luck changes. We had a spell like that right after our father died. Night after ceaseless night, nothing to show for it. We'd throw out our net, show nothing in return. We started to think it was going to be like this forever, it seemed. One morning, we were down at the beach, cleaning out the boat and fixing our nets for the day, when we noticed a gathering down the beach a bit. Folks were over there listening to a local rabbi by the name of Jesus. I had met Jesus. I had actually heard him speak a few times and even talked with him a couple times. I respected him, like any Jewish man respects a rabbi. But the truth is, as far as my relationship with God goes, well, my relationship with God was it was kind of like my relationship with fish. We just weren't connecting right then. He, as he spoke, gathered a larger and larger crowd, and they began to push him literally back toward us down the beach until eventually he found himself right next to our boat and then backed right into our boat. He looked down when his heels hit and saw me. "Ah, Simon, good to see you again." And then, And then he stepped into my boat and sat down. Take me out for a ways, Simon? Well, not really, I didn't want to, but everybody was waiting and expecting it. And so I stepped into the boat with Jesus for the first of many, many times. I took him out a ways, and he began to, right from that boat, teach this huge crowd that had gathered. I really wasn't listening much. I was tired, but when he was done, I got ready to take him back on shore when he said, "Let's go out a bit further and throw out the nets." Oh, Jesus, really? But Jesus, when he speaks with a sense of authority. And when he says something and asks you to do something, you figure you probably ought to do it. So I rowed out further, got ready to cast the net. I really wasn't expecting anything. But the moment that those ropes left my fingers, I had this feeling, this shiver, that drought in my life was about to end. And sure enough, when that net hit the surface of the water, every single fish in that lake ran toward it. "Simon, Simon," or Andrew, I shouted to my brother on shore, "help!" And he grabbed a boat and a couple friends, and they came out, and we hauled in more fish that day than we had seen in months. But when I got on shore, I just found myself falling to my knees in front of Jesus, saying, "Jesus, just leave. Would you just leave?" You might wonder why I would ask someone who seemed to know how to fish pretty well to leave. But look, let me say it this way. You can hope for a miracle. You can pray to the divine at the temple. But when God shows up and is sitting in your boat, it's a scary thing. So I said, "Lord, please leave. I'm a sinful man." I didn't even dare look him in the eye. But when I looked back up again, he was still there, studying me, as if he saw something in me that I didn't see in myself. "Don't be afraid," he said. "From now on, Simon, you will fish for people." And that's the day that I became his follower, his disciple. Not because I felt obligated, not because I was particularly religious or good. I just liked hanging out with him. And he invited me to do just that. And my brother Andrew as well, and two other brothers we knew, James and John. And soon there were 12 of us that were gathered together, walking all over the place, being his followers. He said he would teach us to be fishers of men. We didn't know what that meant at the time, but we learned day by day, lesson by lesson, about the kingdom of God, where the weak are the ones who are the champions, and where the people who are broken are the ones that are made whole again, and where ordinary fishermen can become people that change the world. Well, we went all over the place, mountains and deserts and cities and villages. But for this fisherman, the best moments happened by the sea. And in one case, on it. We had just heard that John the baptizer was dead, murdered by Herod. When Jesus got the news, he was distraught, unsettled. It was clear he just needed some time to himself with his Father, but But the crowds were relentless. Finally, we found a break in it all, and he sent us off across the lake. He went up to the mountain to pray. Now, there's something you need to know from this fisherman. You can respect the sea, you can work the sea, but make no mistake, the sea is not your friend. The sea owes you nothing. Every time you cross that lake of Galilee, you hold your breath every single time, because anytime, out of nowhere, a storm can hit you. Even the most seasoned sailor can miss the signs or be too tired to see them. So I was asleep on that boat when the wind started to shift and the rain hit. I immediately roused all the rest, but too late. The storm was already hitting us full tilt. Water was splashing into the boat itself. The men were starting to panic. We were in a real mess, and we all knew it. One of the guys started praying. Another one grabbed a bucket and started to bail. I think he had the right idea. See, you never want to get caught on that sea when a storm hits asleep. The only thing worse than seeing a storm is seeing a ghost. At the 4th hour of the night, we saw something coming toward us on the water. It looked like a man walking on the Whitecaps. Somebody swore. Fishermen have a way with words, right? The rest of us just sat there in the boat in stunned terror. As he got closer, though, we recognized the figure to be Jesus. "It's me," he said, as if we just bumped into him on the street of the village. "Don't be afraid." "Yeah, right," somebody said. But you know, with that wind pelting me in the face, that rain drenching me, at that moment I just had a feeling. A feeling like all my life I'd been afraid of the storms and the sea, but I didn't want to be afraid of them anymore. And if Jesus said I didn't need to be afraid, well, then maybe I didn't. And so I just shouted out into the wind, "Lord, if that's you, call me to come out there and be with you on the water." "Come," the shout came back. The boat rocked as I stood up, and I awkwardly started to put one foot over the side of the boat and held my breath as if I was going to dive in, and then push myself from the side. And then I almost laughed out loud because I realized that I was standing on the water more firmly than I had been on that rickety boat just a few minutes before. And there, with Jesus on the water, I felt like every ounce of my being was alive, like I was invincible. Like, it's hard to kind of explain it all, but I was doing it. I was walking on water with Jesus. It was glorious. And then a thunderbolt struck, and the blast of wind hit me in the face, and I looked around at how far away I was from the boat, and suddenly I started to sink from my ankles down to my knees. "Lord, help me," I shouted to him, and he immediately grabbed me by the arms and lifted me up, and together we stepped back into the boat. "Oh, you of little faith," he said. And then he laughed. Why did you doubt? Why did I doubt? But I had a question for him. Why did he let me do it? I mean, it was a crazy thing to ask. To walk on water? I mean, there's nothing spiritual about that. It's not like preaching a sermon or healing a blind man. And yet, there was something that happened on the water that was spiritual. Because it was out there on the water that my eyes were open and I began to see him in a whole new way. Well, there were plenty of other lessons for me to learn and plenty of mistakes for me to make. But when that most critical question came, who do you say that I am? The answer out of my mouth was as strong as the storm that taught me the truth. You are the Christ, the Son of the living God. And that day, Jesus called me Peter, the rock. What does a fisherman that spends all of his time on the water, rock, what does that mean? I didn't know at the time, but I did know he was the Messiah, and I did know I would follow him. Well, all of it came to a head in many ways. A few months later, when the Passover festivities began, Jesus was welcomed into the city like a hero, like a king returning to his own home. It should have been a great day, but underneath, things were starting to fray. We were bickering with each other more than ever, not with Jesus, with each other, pestering him with questions like, which one of us is the greatest, and other foolishness like that. It was clear that we had been on the road with each other way too long, and we were learning how to push each other's buttons, even those of us that had been brothers ahead of time. And it was also clear that Jesus was in a mood too. One moment, he would be all warm and friendly, talking about how much he desired to have the Passover meal with us. The next, he would be all dark, talking about death and suffering and his own death. Finally, I put my foot down. Never, Lord. These things will never happen to you. What I meant was, you can't leave us, Lord. This is all about you. We wouldn't know what to do without you. He rebuked me in front of everyone. He said I didn't understand the things of God. And he was right. I didn't understand them. And that night when we had the Passover meal, he got down to wash our feet. I said again, never, Lord. You'll never wash my feet. He said, well, if I don't wash you, you can't be clean. Well, Lord, then not just my feet, everything, my hands, my head as well. He just looked so tired to me. He said, you are clean. But not all of you. One of you will betray me. Well, that just got us bickering with each other all the more. And so by the end of that night, we were exhausted. And frankly, I was the one that was looking for just one thing, a bed. But then Jesus announced that he wanted to go to a local garden to pray. Anybody want to join him? Well, not really, Jesus, but you're the master. And when we got there, he said, watch and pray that you fall not into temptation. Well, yes, Lord, whatever you say. But it only had been a moment or two after leaning against that tree that I began to nod off. And the next time I opened my eyes, Jesus' face was right next to mine. He was whispering, Simon, could you not stay awake and watch with me for an hour. I tried to wake up as quickly as I could. And then he got more serious. Simon, Satan, has demanded to have you, to sift you like wheat. Well, that woke me up, believe me. Well, you said no, certainly, Jesus, to him, didn't you? I've prayed for you, Simon, that your faith would endure all of this. The night just was so black at that moment. And it began to feel like it was coming in, crushing me. I had that same feeling I'd had as a child when I almost drowned in that sea. But finally I broke through and said to him, Lord, I would do anything for you. I would die for you. Would you? He said, looking over my shoulder as if he saw something coming. The night crackled. There was a wind in the tree. And footsteps on the path when suddenly that garden of prayer was invaded by armed soldiers led by, of all people, one of our own. He had come and he had brought them. And they were there to arrest him. And I said to Jesus, Jesus, this is no game. You need to run. You need to flee. You need to call down fire. Something. But he didn't. And Judas kissed him. And then he went along with him. But it didn't seem like surrender. It felt like resolve. When they left, we all melted into the darkness. Before we could even nab Judas, he was gone. And the rest of us just kind of went off in our own way. We didn't know where to go. Jesus didn't ask us to follow him. He must have known us better than we thought. But I kept thinking about what he had said to me, that Simon, or that Satan wanted to sift me like wheat. And I was afraid of what was to come. Well, they took Jesus to Caiaphas' house, and there was a fire pit in the courtyard. I got up close so I could warm my hands and just listen to what people were saying about the whole thing. Maybe they would just issue him a warning and let him go. They'd done that before. But this felt different. Two girls were on the other side of the fire. They were staring at me, whispering. Finally, one of them said out loud, "You're one of them. You're one of his disciples." "I am not," I shouted. The lie burnt. But I stuffed down the shame of it all and stepped back into the shadows. The next few hours came. Some of the disciples passed by as well, although we pretended not to know each other. It got to be about dawn, and I started to be tired again. And then one of the men there accused me. "You're one of those disciples of his. You are one of those that goes with that prisoner." "Me? No," I said, my heart pounding in my chest. I didn't like the way some of those soldiers were looking at me. "Sure you are," another one said, holding his spear, getting it ready. "I can tell you're one of them by your accent." "I don't even know him," I shouted more loudly than I even wanted to. Just then, the door of Caiaphas' house opened up, and there stood Jesus, accompanied by two guards. His face was bloodied and swollen from all of the punches, But he looked right at me. The way he had looked at me so many times before, that look of knowing, my stomach turned. The rooster crowed. It's funny in life. The one thing you know not to do is the one thing you end up doing. Before the rooster crows 3 times, I had to get out of there. I just bolted away from the fire, tripping over legs and logs, and started to run. I didn't know where I was running. I just ran and ran until I could run no more, collapsing, and finally I just started to weep bitterly. And the next time I saw Jesus, he was dead. When someone's gone, your life is full of the things you never said. You matter to me. I'm grateful for you. I love you. You remember the time when? But the worst thing you never said were things like, I'm sorry. I need to apologize. I need to make this right. But see, I lost that chance. Well, in the next day and a half, we all found each other again back in that upper room, except for Judas. We so longed to sense his presence again, but he wasn't there. And so instead, we just bickered and argued and pushed each other's buttons and blamed each other. But then, on the 3rd day in the morning, well, reports started to come in. Some women had been at the tomb and had found it to be empty. He's not there, they said. He's risen, whatever that meant. And then another woman who said she'd seen him in the garden and actually talked to him. Later still, 2 people came back from Emmaus saying that they'd had dinner with him. Well, John and Peter and I, we had to see this for ourselves. So we raced to the tomb. John got there ahead of me. By the time I got there, he is breathlessly on the outside saying, "It's true." "What's true?" I said. "What can be true now? Who do we count on now? Who can we depend on now?" It was only that night, when we were again in the upper room with all the rest, that Jesus himself came and appeared to us. He stood among us and showed us his hands and his feet. He gave us that sign of peace to us. And that's when I did know the truth, that he had died and had come back to life again. And he appeared to us that night, and then a week later, same place, same time. But in both times, in both places, I held back from him. I said nothing. I was ashamed. I felt unworthy. Well, in the coming days, we left Jerusalem, made our way back to various places, many of us back to Galilee, to that village by the sea, to our families there. Old habits die hard, don't they? And one afternoon, evening, I said to the rest, "I'm going fishing." What I really wanted was some time to myself on the boat. But then everybody else chimed in, "We'll go with you." Thanks. And so instead of one quiet, restful night on the boat, listening to the waves lapping against the side, I spent the night listening to four guys snoring. We said nothing. We caught nothing. It really was like old times. But in the morning, a figure appeared on the beach. "My sons," he said, "have you any fish?" Could we get no rest even now? John shouted, "No, no fish." "Put your net on the other side of the boat," he said. That morning light glimmered on the waves of the surface of that sea. And as we threw out the net on the other side, it was so filled with fish that we couldn't even haul it in. John said to me, "It's the Lord." And I knew he was right. It was the Lord. And I also knew I wasn't going to miss a chance again to see and to be with him. And so clumsily, I leapt out of the boat, as clumsily as I had fallen as a child. And with the same resolve I had used in walking on those waves, I splashed and thrashed my way to the shore. And there he was, crouching over a fire. Or at least it looked like him. Not exactly like him, though. And the rest came up. And none of us asked who he was. We knew who he was. "Have breakfast," he said. I hadn't had an appetite for weeks, but that morning I ate. But after the breakfast, he motioned to me to walk with him. Here it comes, I thought. The reprimand. The moment he tells me that I'm no longer fit to be part of the team. But I just needed some time with him anyway. So I went with him. We weren't but a couple feet away from the rest when he turned to me and said, "Peter, Simon, son of John, do you love me more than these?" And he pointed to the fish in the boat in the village. "Yes, Lord," I said, "you know that I love you. Tend my sheep." "Peter, Simon, son of John, do you love me?" A second time he asked. A second time I said, "Yes, Lord, you know that I love you. Feed my sheep." And still a third. "Simon, son of John, do you love me?" It pained me that he asked me 3 times. "Lord, you know everything. You know that I love you." And just as I said those words, it was like he was pulling me up out of the sea again. And he was rescuing me again. I knew that I had failed and fallen and I was imperfect and had made all kinds of mistakes. But I also knew at that moment that I was still someone that belonged to him and someone he had forgiven. And for a long time, we just stared out at the sea side by side. The very same place that our journey together had begun and was now about to begin again. And then he turned to me and said, his last words, "Follow me." And I thought, I can do that. I can't do it perfectly, but I can do that. I can be someone that follows and does his work. When I was a man, I almost drowned in a sea of guilt and shame and despair. But a man named Jesus found me out in that storm and brought me to himself. He showed me that my failures aren't the final say. He is the finest man and the greatest fisherman I have ever known. And I intend to fish with him the rest of my life.